everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to be sitting in a third session to discuss contemporary development issues. I certainly look forward to this session. It has a lot. I'm being very ambitious here, and I hope that my ambitious agenda will be successful. But we shall see how we do. In any event, there will be a lot of information to work with, but it's a very ambitious session. Being the last session, I had an agenda to leave you in a good place. So thank you again for having me. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everybody who is in attendance. Today, we are going to talk about global finance architecture. It's a huge title there, but you will see that I have tried to break it down to something manageable. There will be in this session basic information that some of you may already be familiar with, or all of you. And then there will be more contextual information from my end that you may not be that familiar with. Then we shall see how the two sit together. In other words, my agenda today is to take cue from international financial institutions to local responses. Because you will recall that I'm trying to move the slide, that's why it's being in, okay, now it moves. You will recall that we talked about the difficulty of responding to development problems using blueprints that have been agreed upon on a global sort of forum consensus making a platform. And that often what happens is that those blueprints the government of the day in the local context will try to implement them, and we'll have to encounter the reality that might force certain changes or might trigger certain local responses. So I want to take the topic of finance. It's certainly a broad topic. We can't touch everything, but I want to try and imagine how those articulated finance positions at the level of global institutions actually engage with local responses. We shall see whether we succeed. In any event, there will be a lot to continue maybe researching and thinking about. So that's a recap of what we've done so far. That whole plank of, we are starting with international encounters that create problems that demand solutions, and the solutions have a duality of the international and local responses. Then we said that in that process of articulating the responses to these development problems, you have three moments of law reform: Law Reform 1, Law Reform 2, and Law Reform 3. And we say that it is in somewhere between Law Reform 2 and Law Reform 3 that you begin to see that the international prescriptions are not working, and the local responses are beginning to get some attention. Then, how do we take now those levels of analysis to the finance question? So there would be two levels at which you analyze development finance. The first one, and we touched some of it last time, has to do with formal financing. The second one has to do with informal financing, and that's where we are talking about the local responses, which we are defining as arrangements that are outside the control or supervision of the state. But in Law Reform 1 and in Law Reform 2, but mostly in Law Reform 1, we created a state that would be the entity in charge of spurring development in colonial and post-colonial contexts. And with that, also an attempt to create markets-driven development. In that context, that's where you will have formal finance, because the development finance that will go through the state, maybe from the international markets or from international institutions or from donors, or even local taxation to the extent that that can be achieved or has been achieved, will be formal finance that's arranged formally through this entity we have created that is a state. Okay, then we also said that because of the need to create an international trade and investment regime, since that international trade and investment system is what enables the country to sort of move in the path of development that also allows foreign currency accumulation that's required to meet international obligations. You would be having foreign direct investment and private banks, maybe syndicate lending that has its own infrastructure and or its own architecture, both as investment law and international corporate finance law, capital markets, whatever other avenues, borrowing, structured finance. So that market as a formal financing mechanism. So within that, the entities, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, are created to support both systems of finance, whether it is through the state or through the market. But you have others, obviously. You will have international foundations and others we talked about, especially in law reform too, where you're beginning to have international foundations intervening in local contexts in order to promote all, a range of things, maybe environmental protection, maybe human rights. So that's another way, or maybe women's groups, maybe indigenous communities. That is formal finance. So we will be contrasting that with informal finance. Again, on the basis of an assumption that formal finance doesn't work that well. It doesn't cover everybody, it doesn't cover everything. In many places and instances, it fails, all right? So I will discuss informal finance, and I said again, it's an ambitious agenda. So I will explain what it is, what is informality. I've tried to simplify it and present it as in 4 ways that you easily, even in your own context, recognize. Then how does that informality influence development and finance? How can we critically assess informal finance in the context of development? And then how do the two, the formal and informal, meet at some point? And digital finance, microcredit lending, and all these other ways of financing the informal sector, how do the two meet? How do they engage ultimately? All right. Okay, so that's the layout of the session. So let's start at the beginning, the formal finance. We have the International Monetary System, all right, under the International Monetary Fund. And its key commitments are to promote international trade. Think back, we formed a state and we started creating markets, industries, factories, all that. Mission to feed into global trade, investment, ease of transfer of goods, raw material and all that, right? Ease of business transactions, okay? Cross-border capital movements, all that requires currency. It's a mandate of international monetary law to make that process possible. And because we live in a world where every nation has its own currencies, there will be questions of if you are doing cross-border trade and having to handle multiple currencies, how do you create an international monetary system that makes that possible without creating unfair advantages on one side or the other? How do you do currency equivalences? How do you convert currencies? How do you pay back debt? In what currency? How do you make the world trade order more open and functional? How do you sustain economic growth across nations and regions? So that is why we have the International Monetary Fund, and I have summarized for you, and this you can look up quite easily even by yourself, but I want to create momentum for where we are going with this analysis. So it's established, okay, to stabilize or to create a stable international monetary system for the reasons just stated: international trade and investment, growth, okay, stable monetary regimes within states and currency exchange arrangements, free convertibility of currencies. And its functions are stated: coordination, and I find it interesting that they use surveillance, because surveillance is such a hot word these days with all the technology. So coordination and surveillance of monetary relations, okay, and interest rate policies, and assistance and economic assistance to the nations in difficulty. What are the objectives? Same thing, so international monetary cooperation, all right? So this is a sort of the headquarters of these conversations and discussions about how to create international monetary cooperation, because people won't come to the table themselves. This institution is able to facilitate those conversations. International trade, as already mentioned, to facilitate, expand, and balanced growth of international trade, to promote exchange stability, to establish a multilateral system of payments. You're going to do trade, you're going to import things, you're going to do transactions, you need a system of payments. Then, to give confidence to members by making the resources of the fund available to states in distress, and to shorten the duration and lessen the degree of disequilibrium in international balance of payments of members. So you get a sense. We repeat them here in class to lay down the background that we are operating in when we talk of local responses. This looks very well done. How could we say that systems established by the International Monetary Fund don't seem to be working that well? Okay, it is laid out really well. So there you have currency exchange regimes, and the key issue here is where the currency of a particular nation, how it behaves internationally. Is it convertible? If it's convertible, how is it convertible? What are the agreements? Is it pegged on a fixed currency, or is it floating convertibility or exchange? And the importance of that is you may have heard Donald Trump complain a lot about China sort of doing currency manipulation and affecting the exchange, currency exchange with adverse effects to the rest of the world or to the United States. But we have these options. A currency doesn't have to be pegged to particular currency, there can be an arrangement or a commitment to float it and for it to change across time. So these are the kinds of negotiations that would be hard, and maybe where you, if you are allowed fewer restrictions, it could be because of your strength in the global monetary system. So countries with lower bargaining power may not be able to negotiate for how, what currency exchange regime they can have. So this is just a historical note about the gold standard, which was, we don't need to go into now, but it helps you understand the need for currency stability in the international economic system. That's the IMF and currency questions. I'm moving quickly because I also want to stop at the right time, which is within an hour, so that we can have a conversation. But of course, feel free to ask any question as I go along, or even note it down, so that by the time we are coming to the end of my presentation, you are able to remember your question. Well, with the IMF, we talk about currency stabilization and surveillance and cooperation, convertibility, monetary policies, working with the central banks, and so on. The World Bank mandate has a clear development mandate. So there is the World Bank and institutions that are affiliates of the World Bank. And they are, as you can see on the screen, and there is a purpose to them or a logic to them, which you should see shortly. The purposes: reconstruction and development, seeing that the World Bank came from a post-war context in the middle of the last century after World War II. So reconstruction and development is a clear mandate of the World Bank. But you would think that the World Bank only deals with the state or the public entity. No, it has a mandate also to promote private foreign investment. And this is a link you need to make. And that's why you have the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, item number 23, which provides, promotes private investment, as well as the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, which also is geared towards encouraging private investment by providing the assurance that should the foreign investor have a dispute, there is this place that the foreign investor can go to have those disputes with the host state resolved. And that ICSID is an entity within, or within the framework of the World Bank. The guarantee agency is to say that if the state doesn't honor its obligations, there would be some way the foreign investor has some guarantee. So you see that. So private foreign investment is a clear mandate of the World Bank. And it also, in addition to providing those institutional guarantees of a guarantee, a place for dispute settlement, there is also advancing actual financing through private channels. Then there is a mandate for international trade, just like with the International Monetary Fund. There is a mandate of loans privatization, which is a sequencing of loans in line with the projects that need to be funded and to be done. A mandate to improve the business conditions for international investment, right? A mandate to improve the business conditions for international investment. You may have recently heard of the World Bank's controversial ease of doing business index, and might have wondered where does that come from. So that would be flowing from this fifth purpose, to promote good business conditions for international investment. So where does the World Bank get its financing? Like most other financial institutions, those are the four places the World Bank would be getting money in order to do all these things, including lending to states and lending to private investors. So it will go to capital markets. It can float notes, which is borrowing from the public and paying back later using that money for investment. It can borrow from central banks. But also noteworthy is item number 4, which is that the World Bank can establish special objectives trust funds to respond to particular and unique problems that require very specific response. So trust funds, it can do that. All right, still on the World Bank, what are its financing instruments? It gives loans, it gives concessional interest rates, it provides guarantees for loans. As we said, you have private entities that may want a World Bank guarantee in order to engage a particular state member. So the World Bank can give loans. It also gives grants. Some sticking points for discussion when we talk about the World Bank. First is that the World Bank, when it's established, its articles of establishment, the treaty founding, establishing the World Bank, has a commitment called the political neutrality principle. And essentially that means that it is not to engage in the internal affairs of a country that it is loaning to. So non-interference is also an important international law principle, as you are aware. So 2 issues arise from that. The World Bank has been making even political demands of countries, especially countries that need to structure or restructure their economies. And the question has always been, does that breach the political neutrality rule? When the World Bank says you must follow these good governance principles. And then the World Bank now finds another institutions, other states, including the United States, must live with the fact that China as an investor nation, China as a lender nation, actually practices non-interference. Why? Because China can lend in any country and engage any country. There could be the worst possible, violations of rights, undemocratic rule, and China actually is committed to that because China's other principle is that it works with equal partners and it respects the equality of sovereigns. So it is not for China to tell other sovereigns how they should run their own domestic affairs. So those are 2 issues, 2 questions that are in this. The second are, the relative power of every state that's a member of the World Bank. What are their voting rights? Who has more voting power? It's the same with the UN. You have the Security Council. Some states have veto power, others don't. Others don't sit in the Security Council, so on and so forth. The constitution of these international organizations, if you're sitting in a third world country or an African nation, you do not have as much say because voting rights are pegged to your contributions and the strength of your contributions to the entity. So there's a question of, is there fair representation, especially if the bank is going to be involved in internal governance and management of states? Should the people of those nations feel that they deserve good representation when these decisions are being made? Then there would be questions about the sources of the bank's funds. And thirdly, whether the bank is actually accountable for what it funds. Can it fund anything? Can it fund a tobacco factory? Can it fund something, a project that destroys the environment? So to respond to that criticism, what the World Bank did was develop the World Bank Inspection Panel. And more recently, the International Financial Corporation has a performance standards on social and environmental sustainability, whose mandate is to assess whether projects that are being funded have accountability measures. So access is obviously a problem for African nations, even for some private investors. And therefore, these affiliate institutions of the World Bank were created to respond to those access problems. So the International Financial Corporation, which is an affiliate of the World Bank, funds private investors, right? The International Development Association is also specific to a particular constituency, and that is it funds low-income states, which might, the way finance works is that it needs to be affordable. And if you're a low-income state, you probably cannot compete or get financing at the market interest rate. You couldn't get a Eurobond, at the rate that's offered at the market and manage to pay back. So the International Development Association lowers that barrier to accessing finance. Then there would be regional banks such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and there are many other banks. And a historical note would be the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was pushed by China, and of course, American, at least I know for sure, the US, which is a strong player or enjoys strong powers within the World Bank, and IMF was not very welcoming of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because then it means losing some power to the fact that another entity can actually provide international development financing. So all these are areas to note because we don't go into depth. We might, but they probably deserve more attention and research work. Of course, the BRICS countries also have their own bank and their own fund. I would have noted an African-based international fund, but it has not taken off yet, established within the African Union. We are yet to see whether it takes off and whether it works out. So we have said that is how countries access finance through the international institutions. That state we created, and those market actors that will be in that market state arrangement that we have created. Roughly, when they would want to get international financing, one way would be to go through the World Bank and affiliate institutions. Of course, there are also international capital markets. They could launch a bond and so on. And if they're private investors, maybe they're also already listed in one of the important stock markets. And maybe that is where also another way that they raise their capital for investment. That is an interesting conversation, but maybe we cannot have it here, because if you're sitting in Kenya and you have a huge telecoms firm that's a private entity that also trades, say, in New York Stock Exchange and is doing really well, you feel there's a conversation there to be had about the strength and power of international investors in that regard, and whether any of those benefits actually come down to the people, or if the states it benefits if those governments have some stake in the stock of those international funds. But it's a conversation for another day. Who owns these companies? In summary, of course, if there's going to be finance, we say the state may not have a tax base from which to finance its activities or a sufficient one. And therefore, there's a question of repayment of debt. So I think let's start here. So what is the question here? So we have sovereign debt. What is the problem? You've borrowed from the World Bank. You have debt, which is now a very common thing. Debt-distressed countries. Whatever source you borrow from, you still have to repay. But let's start with the problem of access to finance. So you start, and at least the assumption of the International Monetary Fund is that you have countries that have sound monetary policies. And there's also an assumption that you access international capital markets. That access depends on your strong credit. So paying debt is very important. If you do not pay debt, so number 3, bad debt, like bad cholesterol, is readily available for needy governments. Or put it this way, people who want to give money to states that shouldn't be given money, as in they are getting into bad debt, there are places they can get this money. We don't have a neat system that says, now you can't borrow anymore. Countries can always borrow. If there were restrictions, then we would not be having crisis after crisis after crisis. Yeah, so we are saying the possibility of getting into bad debt is very easy for states. And we do not have very good international response to that. And the domestic legislative or other regimes that should be checking on debt are not there. Some countries have tried to create debt ceilings to tell the state, you cannot borrow beyond this limit. But those same legislators could also change that law to allow more borrowing, all right? Which leads then to budget deficits, all right? Which leads then to the fact that that particular sovereign cannot borrow cheap. The more debt you have, the more interest you have to pay. So it becomes a vicious cycle. You are in a hole and we will give you more to get into the hole deeper in the form of high interest rates. And then high interest rates, to dig your hole even more, will limit your access to loans, bonds, capital markets, because you're going to be rated by credit rating agencies. That is one, access to finance. How a debt situation can put a country in a place where it cannot access finance. I think it was yesterday or the day before that the news reported that World Bank had decided not to allow Zimbabwe to take any more debt. They just said no. And that is not good, because it means Zimbabwe can't, that creates a chain reaction where it can't access any kind of finance. And the situation on the ground could be really dire for Zimbabwe. Access to finance. Number 2, how debt affects sovereignty and sovereign function. The threat of loss of strategic assets that have been given as collateral for debt. The threat of currency inflation and the need to print more money in order to cushion the economy from bad outcomes. And then the problem that once inflation sets in, there will need to be interventions to stabilize the currency. Again, this is IMF central bank interaction. And when the IMF must come in to help you as a sovereign with your debt crisis, harsh austerity measures will follow. harsh austerity measures mean pain to the ordinary person who had nothing to do with creating the debt in the first place, but in whose name that debt was incurred. And then you would know from the EU situation that when you have a regional economic crisis, every nation, even though being part of the regional arrangement, must take care of its own debt problems. So there's a sense in which when the party is on, everyone is in. But when you're in trouble, to prevent a contagion or the spreading of problems, that country might be isolated first so they can deal with their own problems, all right? Then should a global emergency occur, then countries that are already heavily indebted will have a more difficult time borrowing in order to respond to emergencies such as the corona pandemic, right? So now you see then the World Bank having to work around, do we create special funds to respond to disease emergencies, climate emergencies, and so on. And these have not yet been thought through properly as of yet. Everyone is trying to get the answers. And of course, ultimately, the pain is felt because of the downgrading of the sovereign's credit rating in global financing platforms or regions. Third item on sovereign debt problems is fairness. There is something about downstream effects of over-leveraged economies, that it is not the upper classes in that society who should be making better monetary decisions that get the brunt of it. It is the people who are downstream, and there isn't a good way yet to cushion them from those effects. Then the handicapping of internal institutions. So if a parliament was to respond, how would it respond? What laws, policies would be made that late in the day to help in any way, right? So then there's a sense that these austerity measures that the IMF must bring in order to stabilize the currency, stop the inflation, are done outside the recognized assemblies of representation and legislative authority. Item number 4, debts will be paid. But those debts are agreements and loan agreements require these countries to pay in hard currency, not in local currency. At a time of crisis, the last thing you probably have is hard currency. So we do not have a good answer to why debt is pegged to hard currencies, all right? We talked earlier about secrecy contracts and secrecy borrowing. We have talked about the question of unfairness, that somehow the international monetary, economic, investment, trade regimes tend to favor misappropriation by local political elites and to exacerbate inequality, all right? Then there are institutions that have already been created, say by the World Bank, to protect foreign private investors, even in times of economic crisis. That leaves local investors wondering, who is going to protect us? The foreign investors have, whatever guarantees they have from the World Bank, but what about the domestic investor? Okay, so I will pause there for a minute and say that there's a bit of information about international trade and investment that I would like to skip so that I can go to a discussion of informality, because then you get to understand more what the local responses within the finance context are. But if we had more time, I would have wanted to talk about international trade and investment and the problems that international trade and investment we are seeing once it leaves the World Bank's mandate of promoting international trade and investment. How does it hit the ground? How does the rubber meet the tarmac? Okay, so Professor, I will take probably another just 15 minutes and explain what the local responses are, and then we shall have an open conversation, if that is okay. And I think you're muted. Are you muted?
Yes, in order not to disturb the
oh, I see. Okay.
part. Yes.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank
you.
you. Yeah, thank you so much. The good thing is we have talked about states and markets as a formal site for development projects. And you are already familiar with the framework that I have created. So when I talk about informality, the question is, what about outside state structures? What about outside state law? What about outside the formal bank, which is, the market, emblematic of the market? What about outside the formal judicial system? Okay. What about outside health? Earlier on, we said about traditional birth attendants who are very efficient, who do better with more support in terms of helping rural women who cannot reach to formal hospitals on time, how those can have safe deliveries. But informality is complex. So I want to explain its complexity. That exists outside states and markets is complex. And the first way we understand it is saying that there is traditional informality. Traditional informality is not good, even though I list it first. It is that system that is assumed to exist by the colonial state.
It's 17 hours.
And because it is assumed to exist by the colonial state, it serves the end of the colonial state. Because the colonial officer cannot be everywhere, he will appoint local representatives, give them titles and perks, so that they can enforce a traditional regime that's outside the state, but that still enables whatever the state wants to do, if it is land acquisition, if it is payment of taxes, if it is whatever state project that needs to be done. And this continues on after decolonization, so that you have traditional informality even within post-coloniality. It looks like tradition, but it really is a state adventure. That's one, traditional informality. Let's talk about another kind of informality, which I'm calling gap fillers. And in the interest of time, I'll give you a quick example that you probably can relate to. Take the story, which I hope you're very familiar with, of the tech industry. In the tech industry, we are told the way there was huge technological revolution in a very short time is because whoever it was, if it was Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs, they managed to create a corporate culture that defied every corporate norm, in the sense that no dress code, right? You can work anytime, you can sleep in the office, those sorts of things. You've heard of them, right? And that relaxing of formality allows innovation, allows especially people who are getting into sectors that do not exist. We don't have computers before. You're the first person ever to imagine a digital world. So it allows those people to move quickly outside the regulation of the state. By the time the state is saying, oh, we need to regulate the digital industry, things have moved on, innovations have happened, and so on and so forth. It is not so different in our context as well. This can be the fact that in this type of informality, contracts can be concluded without having to be in writing. So in trade, commerce, business, and I say trade, commerce, business very deliberately so that you can know that it may be that the engine of international investment, trade, and commerce is not Law Reform 1 or Law Reform 2. It may be that it is these gap fillers who innovate their own norms on the ground, don't use written contracts, have apprenticeship programs where they train each other how to do import and export, since the state may not provide this kind of training, where they have networks of traders, business people, and so on. And they fill those gaps with informal norms and are able to participate in international trade. They are able to have investment. They are able to compete with a more better organized foreign investor, or at least to collaborate with them. So I'll be criticizing the fact that Law Reform 1 ignores the existence of these gap fillers completely, which we are saying, left to Law Reform 1 and 2, would not have computers, would not have Amazon, which thrived on the basis of this other regime that is informal. Okay, I'll go to number 3. Number 3 is informality that comes from necessity. And this is where we talk of development with a human face. You have laws, yes, under Law Reform 1 and 2. But if someone was to follow those laws in their economic conditions, they would be dead. Mothers would be losing their children. If you see them engaging in informality, it is because they must survive. So the question becomes, if a mother steals food in order for a child not to die, if a mother maybe steals medicine from a government hospital in order for, or a private hospital, what kind of criminal justice systems are we imagining in the development context that responds effectively to the need of in such a crisis? They have not followed a formal system of acquisition of food, of what they need. It's a matter of survival. So the people who are in dire need, who probably are in dire need because development programs have left them there. Maybe they're displaced from their land. Maybe they are unemployed. If they are existing, they live in a slum maybe, and they have this normative system that's not within the purview of the state. How should we respond? Should we create more jails? That's the question. To jail them because they are not within the formally accepted way of doing things. And lastly, informality because of the need for political liberation. Maybe you would have the most maybe present example, and not so present anymore, would be South Africa. What sorts of norms can you have under an apartheid regime that's keen on eliminating you? So a study on local responses would look through this and see what to do with it. Okay, so moving on, hopefully this is clear It's more complex probably than I've explained, but I wanted to lay that down. So in this informal context, it's where we are saying, if you can nurture a savings culture, then you can begin to see local responses that lead to investment and trade. Okay. And if you can have a scheme of non-state, non-market driven insurance, then you can have certain social protections that promote informal contexts, that are focused on informal contexts. Then that mother would not have to steal the food or the medicine, because then they would have this social insurance. Similarly, if there is a way to access credit and finance to start a small enterprise within this informal setting, whether you want it as a gap filler, whether you want it as it's a necessity, someone must have a loan, a small loan, or whether you're thinking of it as a move for political liberation, can that be coming up? And finally, financial literacy in most countries is very low. But people who have been in the informal sector and succeeded have their own, they don't go to business school, let's put it that way, right? They actually are able to have a system where generation to generation to generation, they are able to nurture the savings and credit culture through apprenticeship and participation in trade and business along other younger generation people. If we were to take a critical view of informal finance, what would we say? So that you are not left with the idea that it's all good. It needs work, and it doesn't always get the much research attention that it requires. We research banks a lot. We don't research informal credit that much. So the first critical thought I would have is, remember we said traditional informality is state-driven. From colonial times, you have these chiefs, they are patriarchal, they put women down, they are agents of the state, so to speak. So that there's a lot that can be said about that in traditional informality has artificiality, that it does not serve as a good local response, that it reinforces existing structures that we are already criticizing, that it is made up of state-appointed heads who may be also, nodes for state violence against ordinary folks. So it has a problem in that. But number two, it has distributional effect. I'll try and explain this. So you have a traditional system, maybe it's called a customary system. It has identified who is worthy of education, say. And therefore, this, 200 people will be chosen to go to very good schools. They'll typically maybe be men. Maybe they'll come from very important families. And therefore, the financial impact is felt at the generational level because there's a whole then group of other people who are left out. It is reflected in employment, okay? It is reflected in politics. Those will be the leaders who go now. Now I want to make the link between the local and the international. Those are the people now who will negotiate with the World Bank, who will negotiate with the IMF, or who will, get sovereign debt. The distribution effect in that skewed decision making that starts very small at the local level, but has an impact in national politics is a very serious concern. So that's why I say traditional informality is very problematic, because then it has these effects that go all the way to international engagement. All right. So now, where we want to be maybe is with gap filler informality. And this is where the digital savvy of the younger generation comes in, because this is where innovation could take place. And they have received attention from venture capitalists, from angel investors who bypass the state. Again, informality, some of it is about bypassing existing structures, will bypass the state and fund directly and enable innovative young minds to sort of begin to solve a range of problems, from sanitation problems. There are places in this country and other African countries that don't have toilets, that don't have garbage collection. You know, so you could begin to see that informality as being the helpful kind, because it is reinforcing the natural human ability to innovate, to solve local problems. So as a local response, it's a good example of how informality is a good counter to formality. Then, of course, if we think that some informality is made necessary by circumstances, it's necessity, we cannot leave the discussion on development without asking, are we putting that person who actually is in dire need in a place where they can emerge from it, right? And is there any way to enhance their already existing mechanisms of survival within the informal systems so that they can survive even better? And combining 3 and 4, you know, you might have people saying we're going to have a program where we feed school children, so that even if they do not get food at home, they might get food at school, and then that necessity is addressed, and this don't even have to go through the formal state system, which might lose all the money along the way before it reaches the poor kids in school. And then political informality, this is obviously okay and requires organization, because we don't want to live in this state of necessity or problems. At the end, you still have to talk about political bettering societies as a getting just societies as a political question. And of course, if you're trying to change the existing frameworks, you can do it. You can do it formally, actually, and there's been success in the courts, in the judicial systems, and so on, and other spaces. But it starts with the political informality of realizing that you need to change. You probably have to work from outside first. And so this is how I was thinking about the local responses and how one might begin to think about the whole plank, from the international that we talked about, that tells us what its goals are and who is a member state and how they get there, all the way down, right, to that school child who needs food, or to the community that needs sanitation. So at some point, though, to move things forward, informal must meet formal. And this is where we are going to end today's discussion. We have had, I have already mentioned international venture capital. Okay, so that would be one way that the formal and the informal come together in an innovative way, not in a way that says informality is wrong, but in a way that says informality is actually a good gap filler and we could work from there. Then we also have laws that have now established microcredit financial institutions. These are institutions that are capped to cover a particular sector in society that is suffering exclusion from accessing credit. So they will be designed, say, to offer training on financial literacy. They might be designed to offer low interest rates. They might be designed to do other things that promote access to credit. Some might resist and say, that's just replicating the bad things that you talked about and now invading the informal that was working anyway. Why do we need, anyway, why do we need to do this kind of intervention? Does this really help? Is this really a good local response for financing problems? And I can see maybe even the World Bank, since it has special funds, participating in this kind of informal meet the formal. Then of course there are private-public partnerships, and increasingly a lot of countries have passed legislation regulating or providing for private-public partnerships as a way to address the insufficiency of state-led development or the shortage of market participants. And I would believe, especially in areas such as infrastructure development, you may have public-private partnerships, even funded by the World Bank, since the World Bank also funds private investors, that may have a mandate to ensure the formal and the informal meet in terms of how the tendering of procurement is done. For example, maybe they might say you need to procure only from women or some percentage from certain women groups, all right? So the informal could meet the formal. Then lastly, is the question of digital finance in informal economies. This is also a good illustration of the informal meeting the formal. Why? Because digital finance is obviously provided by formal institutions. Some of them are even multinational firms, technology firms or telecom, known telecom brands. But the thing is access. The fact that the people who need this finance don't have to go to a bank manager. In a country where maybe title to property is not allowed for certain people, say women, how do they go to a bank manager and say, I need a loan? Digital finance solves that because it doesn't require a lot of documentation. You probably just need to register on your cell phone. And there's a really nice ending to this, because if you are a woman, you don't have property to take to a bank manager, so they can give you, you give them title and they give you the money, and the title is collateral. The property is collateral. You don't have that, but you have your cell phone. You can get a loan, and over repeated performance, you're paying back the loan. You're running a small business. You're paying back the loan. That data, that this is a good actor, serves for the bank as your security. You see, with formal systems, there isn't a way to say this is a good actor. The only way we know you are a good actor is because you have a title certificate to property. But with digital finance, they're able to track your data. What is the volume of your sales? How is your debt repayment record? What type of work are you doing? What sector are you in? And on the basis of that, then digital finance firms can reach people who would otherwise not benefit from the formal banking traditional system. And that formal banking traditional system links back to the traditional informality I was talking about, that created this elite system that is able to access the banks, but nobody else has such ease. All right. So now here we have another way for access to finance to happen without you showing your face and people discovering you're not really that great under the traditional system. You're just an ordinary person, and your repeat financial performance helps. So what we are saying is that this is what's happening, and it bears a lot of research, a lot of looking into to see actually whether it's impactful. Of course, with something like digital finance, the other thing we worry about is, and that data that these firms are collecting, how are they using it? Are they selling it? Are they controlling? Are they surveilling? So we are not saying it is problem-free. Do we have enough data regulation to protect the masses that have now almost a great percentage, 50, 60, 70% of the population using mobile technology for financial transactions? Do we have controls on that data? And so on and so forth. So Professor, allow me to stop here. And this being the last session, thank you again. I hope I have taken you 30,000 feet up, but also come down and made you understand some of the things that you might see in your own context and how they play out in a different context. So thank you so much again, and I want to turn over to you now.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang'ara, for your very insightful, illuminating lecture, which has summarized, which has rounded up the three parts of your presentation of legal reforms, economic reforms, financial reforms at various levels of polity, the constraints that exist, the unexploited opportunities that also exist, the insights that you have shared with us. I think you have presented so many interesting insights that will certainly encourage our discussions. So I suggest we start first with the questions of the students, and then maybe provide some remarks, and then you wrap up the whole exchange afterwards. So maybe I would now first invite our students to put your questions to Professor Kang'ara. You can put them directly to Professor or via chat, whatever is easier for you. But I encourage to just ask your questions directly without any hesitation. They can do some remarks, comments, or yes, please.
I have one question.
Jean.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so over these three lectures, I understood that the local response to into the fact that the development frameworks in many states is inadequate is to kind of embrace the opportunities that the informal economy offers to populations. But I kept thinking about the fact that if these people, if one embraces informality, but what about in the case of crisis? For example, if you remain within informality, there are no benefits of social security and so on that the state could give to these people. For example, this was well seen during the pandemics. For example, I don't know, I studied a bit like Latin America, for example of Peru. Peru had really, you know, officially normatively very strict measures, and also so all like by the rules, but people still couldn't abide by them and would not get any help because the informal economy is so strong. So what would you say where to meet these two, the opportunities of the informal market, but then again the challenges or threats of it in the cases of crisis? And wouldn't you say that it would also be better if you not only embrace informality but also kind of try to reform the formal sector in a way that it would provide opportunities?
Okay, thank you so much. I think it was Zan. Thank you. What a wonderful question. And you are right. If there's a reason people enter into written contracts, because then you can go to court and enforce it. If you don't have that written contract and you operated on trust, because you know the informal regime is about trust, it's about maybe it is family based or community based or church based or mosque based. If it is an important enough project, you are not able to enforce or rather protect your investment in the formal institutions when you need to. That's one. The second, at some point, you have to interface with the state office of, you need maybe to go to school and they ask you for your ID, or you need maybe to borrow more money and they ask you, do you have a history of borrowing and paying back? Can you show us the contract or that you used? So there isn't any other way. There isn't any way we can say there is no problem with just remaining in the informal system. Certainly many problems. It is just that it takes you further and it creates a platform by which people can begin to ask, how do we do this better? Maybe by bringing formality into informal, or by adjusting the formal to allow more sharing, if that's what people want. But the most important thing is that at the end, the decision on what to do is informed by a response or a reaction. And therefore, in a country where this is happening, you will see that there's a lot of legislative activity in response to these issues. Why? Because even the state itself would rather have more people formally participating than informally, even if for the reason of collecting more tax. But sometimes it's also knowing what is going on and providing social security and other state-given services. Without that, then it is with just the informal system, the state cannot operate unless it figures out how to do so. And that is why you have traditional informality, which is a state-created mechanism to understand informal systems, because then the state will have all these agents who can tell it, this is what is going on, these are the number of children who are in school, this is who should be paying taxes. The problem with that is that it's not democratic. These appointees are just enforcing a traditional regime that's heavily that's patriarchal, so to speak. That's not that progressive. That is not that people will, in the long run, get to political informality of rebellion and resistance because they don't like it. We can agree it is not good that so many have to be in the informal system. The problem we have is how to solve that without making it worse than it already is. Usually when there is an intervention from the state, chances are that things might be worse than they were before. So take even the example of traditional birth attendance. It would mean that those children are not registered as citizens. So should there be, because they are delivered outside the hospital, But one could ask, why would you limit registration of citizens just to hospitals? And not everybody is going to hospitals. Not everyone has a hospital within 2 kilometers of where they live. So for those who are thinking of development, then they need to solve that problem in a way that has a human face. An impulsive response would be, we are going to jail everyone for 3 months for delivering their baby at home. And I wouldn't be surprised if someone thought that was a very good response. And it is a terrible response. So I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on how to address this problem or issue. Or maybe it will never be possible to completely eliminate the informal, and the formal will never accommodate the informal. Which would mean there is room for multiple players in development. It all doesn't need to be centralized from the state. So the question to you would be, must social security be within the state and be provided and monitored through the state? At the same time, you don't want to over-privatize, because you end up privatizing everything. Private social security, private physical security, private hospital, education. We are getting into the question, exactly what is the role of this state that we created? And how can it be reformed from Law Reform 1 so that it also can be responsive in Law Reform 3? Professor, I would say that. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
This is, yes, this is a very broad question, which requires a lot of conceptual thinking. I'm sure that the state, the modern democratic pluralistic state, has a role to play in providing public services at local levels, at regional levels, at the national level, in cooperation with other actors. I don't see any contradiction in this. There is also social welfare can be reformed in progressive ways, not in structural or conservative ways as prescribed so often by the IMF when pursuing structural adjustment programs. Most of these programs are actually cutting, narrowing, shrinking social welfare provisions. They lead to, they actually create or reinforce the level, not only the informal sector, but also the gap between the informal sector and the opportunities for the population. So progressive reforms could be oriented toward creation, establishment of the basic universal income as the ultimate goal of progressive social welfare reforms, but they can start with some of the elements that you have also described in your presentation. With these microcredit financial institutions can be a really very interesting local tool or vehicle for rescuing people, individuals, families, local communities from exclusion. And if I understand correctly, from the development perspective, one of the most trustworthy and the most also credit-worthy group of people and potential entrepreneurs are actually women. So to emancipate local groups, to overcome informalities, to actually empower also families is one of the most efficient ways. This has been proven in practice in so many, say, successful attempts of development, has been providing access to credit for entrepreneurial activities to women. in addition to access to education. They can not only flourish for themselves, but also for their children, and they can also present a good, I would say, role model of entrepreneurial spirit and social solidarity at these micro levels of social development. They can they can provide a stronger, I would say, pattern of social cohesion,
yes,
than the informal sector. So I think that any say involvement of international actors, you described international banks, other institutions, or even bilateral institutions, they should, I think, if my assessment is correct and understanding of the development issues, constraints and opportunities is to support, to empower women in the developing countries. And in addition, I think it is very important also not to discount the importance of the role of the state, of the government, of the public sector in providing public services. You described earlier the missing important, vital public services to the people, local communities, to the various districts. I think without this, it is difficult to provide a sufficient friendly environment for entrepreneurship, for cooperation, exchange, and overall prosperity. So this is my take on the issue of social welfare reform. And I don't think that poor countries or developing countries do not need to have a strong social welfare network. This is one of the missing elements from the traditional model of development. Standard model of development does not talk about the strong social welfare network at the local levels for all social groups. But I would even argue, I think this is also what we have emphasized, the empowerment of women, not for the sake of, I don't know, to please the international institutions or to show how progressive they are, but in order to facilitate or to support or enable real inclusive local developments and prosperity. So this is one of the things that I have in mind when I would like to refer to your another very thoughtful presentation. There are all levels of discussions, right, from local to global. So it's a very broad structure. I think they are interconnected, but not in a very coherent way. So instead of supporting each other, they are canceling each other. Just to to go back to the global financial architecture, you described the situations of the global monetary and overall financial system, which can be, especially in the periods of crisis, very detrimental to the developing countries. They find themselves in these debt traps, and it's very difficult to climb from them. And most of the time, their macroeconomic situation is not so comparatively, is not necessarily worse than the macroeconomic situation of many of the developed countries, but they have developed their own safeguards and safety nets in order to counteract. For example, even we in Slovenia, we are part of the Eurozone, and I think at least in the last 5-6 years, it is shielding us from the, at least partly, from the pressures of international financial crisis. Of course, Greece in 10 years ago was a different example, but I think also the institutional or financial and monetary structure of the Eurozone has learned from this experience how to counteract, how not to allow so many businesses, so many public services even in this financially stressed situation, to go under, for example. And there is no such mechanism at the global level. Has been never developed, right? So you're more or less developing countries in the period of financial distress are at the mercy of international financial investors. Too many of them are of speculative nature, and of these very unpredictable financial flows and outflows and capital flight, which happens in the period of distress. So this is why we are having so many sovereign debt crises, frequently repeated, and in different parts, right, of the world. Argentina is most notable now, but I'm sure there are also other countries that are basically following all the rules, all the prescriptions, all the policies. They also contribute a lot of hardship, or produce or create a lot of hardship for domestic population, for businesses that are already having difficulties in to have access to finance, to liquidity, to continue with their businesses. So how to address this issue? There are a few initiatives at the international levels, like the suspension of debt payment during the pandemic for 1 year, but this is a very limited. It has a very limited effect. There is another major initiative this year of a major proportion, which is the new allocation of special drawing rights by the IMF in the historical amount of like $500 billion US. But also the design of this special drawing rights allocation is not very optimal, because it is allocated according to the national quota with the IMF, which means that the developed countries are equally allowed, or they have a privilege to get access to the new liquidity, and to a much lesser extent the developing countries. So there are so many asymmetries, for example. So there was basically, the idea was, and the encouragement was, that the developed rich countries should actually voluntarily then share or further allocate these funds to the developing countries. But this should be automatically distributed in the necessary ways in order to address the financial distress for the developing countries. There were other attempts at the bilateral levels, again, because of the, say, dollarization or importance of the dollar area. Dollar is an international reserve currency. We know that the Federal Reserve has opened direct facility lines with many countries around the world during the period of financial distress to provide liquidity to the central banks. So this was one effect that actually also, at least to some extent, diminished the extent of the global financial and liquidity crisis during the pandemic. But we know that this attempt has a limited effect. So there are other ideas, initiatives, like if you are familiar with Vera Songwe, she is a vice deputy of the United Nations, the vice deputy secretary. It's her role. She's proposing to establish an African repurchase market, like to create repo market to provide liquidity to within the African states that have difficulties to access international financial markets to become more resilient. So there are elements, there are attempts at the, say, international level with all these deficiencies that are not sufficiently addressed. But I would actually maybe we reduce this level of discussions from the international and global levels back to the domestic policy issues, dilemmas for the developing countries finding themselves in the period of financial distress. I would say, or maybe how to then to improve the chances of successful, say, structural improvements I would say that domestic savings, you mentioned somewhere the culture of savings can be important, both at the level of private citizens and also at the level of national governments, not to produce these reserves as a goal in itself, but as a mean, as a tool to provide domestic capabilities of providing long-term support and finance for all these activities that are vital for overall inclusive development, such as financing long-term education, research, and especially providing, if there is one single niche or policy that it should be more focused on, is industrial policy to provide access to finance for small and medium-sized companies, especially outside these national capitals, the large cities, but also especially the rural or regional areas. We discussed this, elements of, say, limitations that are there. Last time, I remember this very well, that you mentioned, but nevertheless, these are the missing opportunities. And from the perspective of the standardized development models from the international experts and technocrats, some of these ideas that would overcome this already established model of development, you would hear these propositions very rarely. Like you mentioned, public venture funds. This would be an innovative tool, and they can be devised in so many ways. You talked about the corporate culture. I would just mention that one of the culture that goes beyond a traditional corporatist approach is the development of the very innovative model of Mondragon, the cooperation in Spain, in Basque, which is known for being able to include local population, workers, also students, banks, research institutions, companies that work together in one of the most successful cooperative in the world, which proved to be resilient even in the period of financial crisis in Spain, for example. So these are some of the models that are, opportunities, institutions that simply go beyond the current focus, the current design of the development model, which is which will not allow you to move from package from the first package to the third package. I think it will leave the developing countries to be stuck somewhere in between, which is happening all the time. So it will put you into some kind of a global hierarchical order, not at the level as these countries and the potential of the people can and should be. So it is. These are some of the I would say remarks from the perspective of institutional, international financial setting, also domestic financial setting, and the relation between the, say, developing countries vis-a-vis international financial institutions, financial markets, financial flows, and especially toward the Bretton Woods institutions that you described earlier.
Professor, you have given very good comments, and you're always very, very full of ideas. I have taken so many suggestions from your discussion. And of course, Zan's question was a trigger, a very good question. So maybe we have other questions, I don't know.
From the students, yes, please, go ahead. Now is the opportunity.
I know it's a lot of information, but
Indeed. But
yes.
also,
And
so
I'm available to email, and I will, Professor, send you a reading list.
Wonderful.
To accompany the presentation, so that at least if anyone wants to do additional readings, they can look it up.
Great, I will definitely send this to our students.
Yes.
Great pleasure, thank you very much. This will be very helpful. And also thank you very much for offering your readiness to engage further. If there are maybe questions when the students will think more and study about the development opportunities and missed opportunities. But if there are some last minute thoughts, ideas, or remarks regarding our last 3 lectures with Professor Kang'ara, now is the opportunity. Please go ahead. So let me ask you one last question. Who do you think the future agent of change, the broad coalitions say, let's say that we agree, we come to the conclusion that the existing standard model of development from the economic, social, legal, and political perspective is not sufficient, is not adequate to address the challenges of the 21st century. Challenges are knowledge economy, challenges are climate changes, challenges are deep global inequities and inequalities, lack of access to the opportunities, finance, technologies, know-how, many other resources. Where is the agent of change to overcome this architecture, which is designed deliberately? It is not an accident. So basically the developing countries are there to provide relatively cheap labor, natural resources, maybe they can offer places for tourism, but basically they are stuck at a certain level of development. Most of the time they suffer most during the international crisis. Majority of global population actually live in the developing countries, which we tend to forget. Of course, in the developing countries, there are tiny islands, tiny segments of privileged elites that actually more or less cooperate with this with this international framework, mainly for the benefits for themselves, but not for the society at large. And there are analogies also in other parts of the world. Also, Central and Eastern European situation is not far from different, although we have this opportunity to be part of the EU, which reduces, so there is this global division, right, of structure between core countries, semi-periphery and periphery, right? This is a little bit now blurred with the rise of BRICS country, with the BRICS economies to a certain extent, with the rise of also some of the centers in the global south, but these are exceptions to the general rule of the global hierarchies that exist, and they are very persistent. In order, if we want to overcome this, I think we need to forge global progressive alliances.
Yeah.
That would lead to more inclusive and sustainable development, both in developed and developing parts of the world, which will be in the interest of large parts of humanity. But then how to develop this structural change to the existing pattern development, which is not sustainable, and it leads to highly unbalanced and unequal and inequitable development. So it is a very large question for the end, but just, you know, on the basis of your presentations and our exchanges, what do you see? Where do you see some glimmers of hope for more inclusive and sustainable future development? Who would be possible allies in this effort?
Professor, you ask a question that takes me to the 1980s or thereabouts. Because what happened then is that there was a shift from the university being the driver of economic change and innovation. And that shift took that energy force financing to the corporate setting. And that's how you have Silicon Valley and other places. I mean, Silicon Valley could have been a consortium of universities. But whoever who thought that that change needs to happen decided that change would come from startups, corporate settings, and so on, and not from the university and not from state entities. Although with certain investments, say like in outer space, satellites, whatever, those mega ones, what the state did was to get corporate firms work with military establishments, say to research military equipment and develop a military capacity. That's where the energy went. So that you have what Lockheed Martin, which is a defense contractor, but it is, you know, very well supported by the Pentagon, you know, the military establishment. I do not know the background to that as to why that happened. Why did the corporation become the sovereign state bearer? And by that I mean, today the fights are about this corporation and this corporation. As corporations, yes, but as representatives of their own country. So if the EU is trying to regulate who Google may be, it almost seems, or Airbus and Boeing, it almost always seems as if we're talking about corporations, almost as if they were the state itself, in the sense that they can move capital, they can move change, they can move volume, they can affect things. So your question is interesting because it's asking what is the new locus of this force of change, of this force of innovation, but not any kind. It has to be a progressive force. And to be honest, if it is not the university, I don't know what else one would recommend. We are seeing an embrace of military.
It's 18 hours.
In political governance, military taking space to run things, to fix things, as if we are in a post-war context where there's an emergency and things need to be responded to, yet we are not in a post-war setting. So whoever it is that you're thinking about, in my mind, has not emerged yet, but you might have social players who might, for instance, set up progressive banks that can solve financing problems, maybe the microcredit financial institutions. Maybe you have that collaborating with other actors, but to me, the way it seems, it will have to come from very specific individuals who are committed to doing this kind of change work. Otherwise, you're competing with billionaires who have decided that maybe they're going to change a whole country because they're tech billionaires and they have a lot of money. They can make sure everybody has a roof over their head or something like that. And I don't know that that's desirable, that a tech billionaire should be able to have that kind of power. But at the moment, they are the ones who seem to be interested in sustained efforts to solve very basic needs. So I don't know where the progressive force is going to come from, but you're right, an alliance across regions could unlock that force again. The same way it was unlocked from the corporate platform, we could now be moving to other spaces.
So thank you very much. So it's about ideas, imagination, institutional innovations, broad social alliances at all levels of polity, from local, regional to international, may offer opportunities for more inclusive, more balanced development that we witness at present, but we provided some ideas with your help, with your insights. So I deeply thank you on behalf of our class, our students, our faculty, and on behalf of myself for your excellent contribution. And we look forward to our future cooperation. With all the best. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It was a